Welcome to While Our Students Are Sleeping, the Theory and Politics podcast with me, Rolf Strom-Olsen, and my colleague, Reed Van Skank. We're a couple of professors. We teach political philosophy and political communication at IE University here in Spain. And in this podcast, while our students are soundly asleep at their desks, we'll be looking at the thinkers, ideas, and debates that help shape both the current and future political landscape. Thanks for downloading this episode, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, we'll let you know how at the end of the show. Okay, well, our students have nodded off, but we're both wide awake, so let's go squander a perfectly good hour talking about theory and politics. Okay, so my name is Rolf.
My name is Reed.
Welcome to our podcast. Reed, it's our very first episode.
That's right.
Of our new Fresh Out of the Oven podcast. I thought we might want to introduce ourselves a little bit, talk about the podcast. So I am a professor of intellectual history and political philosophy, and I teach in those subjects at IE University. Reed?
I teach media and communication, particularly political communication on the internet, also at IE University.
And this podcast is essentially an attempt to bring together what aspects of political philosophy would you say, political theory, particularly as they apply to some of the political problems and challenges that we're seeing in the present day.
That's right, and we're doing it from two very different but complementary perspectives. I think.
We are a study in contrast, Reed.
Indeed.
I am very old.
And I am weirdly young
He
for a
is
professor.
literally half my age, so that's true.
And I'm American
And I am not American, I'm Canadian. So all this to say that the idea is to bring you consideration of different texts and different thinkers, different ideas, and explore them in some depth to illuminate as best we can some of the issues that we're facing today. For example, climate change, obviously, right? How the political response that climate change is going to require. Another one that I'm interested in is, for instance, looming demographic change. So what's going to be the influence of smaller societies? What kind of political consequences might that have? As well as just the overall perspective on our existing liberal constitutional order and its, let's say, state of health and what we might expect from that order looking forward. Reed, I know you have some of your own interests.
Yeah, most recently my work has been about reactionary groups on the internet, their relationship to digital subcultures more broadly, and what all of those things have to say about the complicated relationship between the internet, digital technology, and the liberal democracies that are desperately trying to rein all of these things in and not doing a very good job of so doing.
Yeah, things are getting out of hand, perhaps a little bit. Actually, it's in that spirit of a politics that seems to be, let's say, seeking answers in the context of any number of different challenges, economic challenges. I think also those demographic challenges, for instance, immigration, so on. That we're looking at our first author, right? So our plan is for today and then going forward to spend a couple of episodes at least exploring the work of Carl Schmitt. So today what we're going to be doing is looking at one of his less known texts, I have to say, what's it called?
Roman Catholicism and Political Form.
There you go. And then we're going to turn our attention to his better known texts, namely political theology and the concept of the political. And I think we might also at some point decide to explore a little bit where we see Schmitt in the world today. But before we get there, I think we need to first sort of cover his actual text, what he actually says. So lay down some foundations in terms of Schmittian theory, explore why Schmitt thought the things he did.
Schmitty ideas.
Well, so if you're going to do a podcast or really any kind of thing about Carl Schmitt, there's one thing you have to say right up front, which is...
Schmitt was a Nazi.
Yeah. By which, do you mean, Reed, that he shared some affinities with far right-wing German ideology? Is that what
No. This is not just somebody that we disagree with so that we call him a Nazi. He was a card-carrying, huge fan of the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Exactly, yes. Carl Schmitt was a very keen enthusiast of the takeover of power by Hitler and the NSDAP, and in fact lent to that regime over the course of its not 1,000 years, but 12-year lifespan, a lot of the intellectual heft that he brought to juridical and constitutional matters, because at the time, Schmitt was one of the leading figures of German constitutional thinking. So a not insignificant person to then provide support for the Nazi regime. But it gets worse, actually.
Yeah, it does
Like
manage
you're saying,
to get worse.
how could it get worse than that? Well, it does get worse.
You see, there's a difference between a Nazi and an unrepentant Nazi. And
Yes.
Schmitt very much falls in the latter category, even as the Third Reich fell, led to the disaster, the ruination of his country. Schmitt dug in his heels. He ended up moving to Spain, marrying a committed phalangist, and dying nice and old and still a fascist.
Yeah, he died in 1985, 40 years after the end of the Second World War, without any clear change in his underlying point of view. So that's just something that we contend with. All people who talk about Carl Schmitt acknowledge that, in fact, his, let's say, political alliances and political alignment, deeply disturbing and deplorable.
And this is why we study Carl Schmitt. We don't study him despite the fact that he was a Nazi, but because he was a Nazi.
Yeah.
In our current times, it's becoming ever more obvious that there are a lot of committed reactionaries who have ideological investments that are different from those of a liberal or a socialist or what have you.
Another reason to look at Schmitt, to read Schmitt, is because, let's call it, the political perspective that his work embraces is, I think, very relevant to the modern day in terms of how people are thinking about their own place in the world and how they see politics.
That's right. Especially when we started to see, for example, Brexit, the first election of Donald Trump, and the main reaction to these events from liberal leading spaces, certainly academia, was one of surprise. We tended to approach these conservative groups of people that were voting for these groups as just stupid, unaware of their own interests. They need to be educated in order to be brought back into the liberal consensus, etc., etc. And reading somebody like Schmitt, of course, also looking at the development of these movements, leads us to see that these people have a comprehensive political doctrine. They're not just uneducated. They think about politics in a way that is different from a liberal, a socialist, what have you. If we just treat them as if we're smarter than them and we have to re-educate them, we're ignoring the fact that they're starting engagement in the political with a completely different set of assumptions as we are. So we would be better served understanding what those assumptions are, also understanding why they are rhetorically convincing for many people, and begin refutation from that point of view instead.
Yeah, well, actually, and as we'll probably see, they're not all wrong. There are moments when we're, I think, probably going to be inclined to agree with Schmitt, even if we don't necessarily agree with his remedy.
Right. For example, I would not call myself a political liberal. As such, when I see some of Schmitt's criticisms of liberalism, I can't help but nod my head. I find myself disagreeing with his preferred implications, but in any case, just dismissing all of this as an artifact of history that's only meant to confuse the foolish is not going to get us any closer to where we need to be.
Yeah. Now, to be clear, the books that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next episodes were not written during the period of the Nazi regime. So what's interesting is to see what he was thinking and why, based on what he was thinking, then when Hitler arrived on the scene and took power in 1933, Schmitt was very enthusiastic about that. So partly what it gives us is an insight into, call it an intellectual reaction to the perception of states in crisis, sovereignty that can't assert itself, liberal democracies that don't seem capable of taking decisions and rising up to the challenges of the day. And so Schmitt's work falls, I think, into a kind of critical decade, the decade of the 1920s, as a response then to this perception of democracy in crisis, liberal constitutionalism as an ineffective form of governance.
That's it. And these same thoughts are ones that prefigured reactionary groups that are rising in our present moment. So if we understand the forms of thought that Schmitt used in order that eventually led him to enthusiastically embracing Nazism when it came to power in Germany, we might be able to understand some of the latent ideas that are leading people towards far-right groups in our present day.
Yeah. I will also add that Schmitt is a serious thinker. He is a very serious intellectual figure. So it's not taking the temperature of the room by a person who had a few opinions. We're looking at someone who was deeply steeped in the Western intellectual tradition and someone whose thought is very complex and worth serious attention. And there's a big scholarship around Schmitt. Lots of people have written books about him, and so he's been, despite the fact that he had these deplorable political views for a long time, people have been paying attention to his political philosophy, precisely because it is, I think, a very serious undertaking.
Right. So something we're probably not going to do in these subsequent episodes is just sit around and dunk on Carl Schmitt in an effort to make him sound like a nincompoop.
Because he wasn't.
You know, he was a
very serious thinker.
Very serious and oftentimes cogent. At times contradictory, but at times, radically not.
Yeah. I think we're going to find actually a lot that we agree on with
right.
Schmitt in our discussion of what he's saying.
And the implications of that agreement were going to be discussed at length as well. Why does it matter that we agree?
But neither of us are going to go join a Nazi party or equivalent.
No.
Okay.
No.
So let's put some limits, some boundaries
Important
around
component.
the importance of. Very quickly, we might mention, so Schmitt's born at the end of the 19th century. I think he was born in 1888. He was born in Germany into a Catholic family. And as we'll see today, Schmitt's Catholicism matters. He studied law. He became sort of a juristical thinker, we might say. So he studied law. He didn't practice as a lawyer, as we might think of it today, but instead be a scholar of constitutional law. And at the time that he was studying, that mattered because German sovereignty in the late 19th century, early 20th century was sort of between, let's say, different forms. So we have the Second Reich, we have a sort of authoritarian model of government, but then at the same time within that we have, and I'm no expert on German juridical landscape of the late 19th century, but at the same time, within the newly comprised German Reich, we have all the different Länder, all the different provinces. They all have their own sort of political form. So he's being brought up in this, call it environment of some constitutional flux. And then for him, the most decisive event, the First World War, followed by the German Revolution of 1919 and the replacement of the Reich with the Weimar Republic. So a lot of what we're going to be looking at takes place in the context of a German republicanism that is really very new, that gets established in 1919, and which I think it's fair to say, Reed, Schmitt doesn't like very much.
Not a huge fan. I mean, it's a republicanism that immediately follows a defeat and what ends up becoming, with some historical hindsight, the basis for not only Nazism, but a revanchist military expansion that is made in an effort to, through a racial ideology, to reclaim this sense of sort of lost German honor.
It's a good point, actually, because you have the German humiliation at the end of World War One. And then from say the perspective of Schmitt, then the German state decides to double down on its weakness.
Right, to become a beta cuck republic.
Yes, I was going to say to embrace a neo-Kantian form of institutional liberal constitutionalism, but
different strokes.
Beta cuck republic, yeah. Sure, why not? So this is one context, at least for Schmitt. And there's a second context, which we don't need to get into too much detail, but it's worth noting that at least some of Schmitt's thinking is coming out of the work of Max Weber, who he knew, and particularly Weber's important work, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which was published in 1905. And then these lectures that Weber gave on this idea of the vocational, the German word Beruf, or calling, we translate as vocation, the vocation of the political. And so Schmitt had attended these lectures. So when we're seeing which were in the late 19 teens, so when we're seeing the work that he's producing in the 1920s, there is a backdrop of a kind of Weberian sociological model of analysis, as well as, I think, a larger element of Weber's assessment of modernity, which I think is the other important element of what's informing Schmitt. Namely, when Schmitt's sort of looking at the world as a young guy, I mean, by 1919, would he have been what? Born in 1888, so that means at the end of the First World War, he would have been 30. In other words, he's not a bitter old man, the intellectual equivalent of shouting at the kids to get off the lawn. This is someone who's, let's say, enfolding his perspective in the context of a future of Germany for himself, right? So it's not a theoretical exercise. This is what's the Germany that he was going to be living in. And so that problem of modernity is not just this sort of question of the muddle of German sovereignty, but also the problem of the success of a rational economic order and what it does to the self. Who can you really be in the context of a modern economic system, a modern market mechanism, all of that kind of stuff. So in that regard, has some affinities with Weber's diagnosis of the problem of modernity.
I mean, all of his contemporaries are coming off of the back end of the 19th century, in which doctrines such as Marxism, for example, to give just one of the more popular ones, are trying to locate political power as almost a mechanistic exercise in the advancement of material structures, such as economies, for example, or realpolitik in the German context, which is a very sort of, maybe this is a bit editorializing, but a cynical approach to politics, which is one emphasizing, immediate gain, pragmatic, etc. And Schmitt, he's seeing a sort of disenchantment that many of his contemporaries, like Weber, for example, are seeing as well. And so on the one hand, you get a sort of angst to the way that he thinks through the political. And this angst, if you've ever looked at reactionary rhetoric for any period of time, is something that they draw upon in order to manufacture consensus. But at the same time, it's a very I wouldn't say abstract necessarily, but a very formal political theory. We're not going to see Schmitt advocating, for example, for certain economic policies or social policies in his thinking. He's thinking about structural systems. He's thinking about the way that power flows.
It is also worth noting, at the end of the First World War, you have a strand of thinking which argues the disaster of the First World War, particularly for Germany, in part because of its political form. So the Weimar Republic could be seen as a corrective to a political problem at a structural level that is informed by the events of World War I. And what you need in order to then get a better state is you need more responsive institutionalism. You need to have a proper set of elections. You need to have a party system where, say, political disagreements can be worked out. You need to democratize this and, let's say, horizontalize the nature of power as it's being distributed inside of the state. And so there's a lot of that happening in the first part of the 20th century inside of German intellectual circles. On the other hand, then you have someone like Carl Schmitt, who argues the problem with the state, the German state, but I think he would argue the state more generally, is in fact precisely because it's being formed or it's being shaped by that kind of thinking.
It shared too much power.
Yeah. So what we need is actually to have a new kind of politics. And so a lot of his work in the 1920s and into the 1930s is built around that question of what that new kind of politics needs to be as a response to this problem of modernity. And that brings us to the text that we'll consider today, which is his work, Roman Catholicism and Political Form. And as I mentioned, not one of his best known texts, but a very interesting text nonetheless, and one that prefigures, I think, some of the ideas that we'll encounter in subsequent episodes that are perhaps more familiar to us, better known as part of Schmitt's thinking. This text was written in I think it was originally written in 1923, but our translation is from the second edition, which was revised in 1924. So that's putting us right in the middle, more or less, of the Weimar Republic. There's a lot of chaos in Germany, actually, at the time. So this is the period of the famous hyperinflation. My memory serves as the Dawes Plan, I think, brought in 1924. So all this to say that it's a text that's being written in the context of a great deal of political and economic uncertainty. And I think one of the ways to read this text is as a Schmittian response to that uncertainty, and a way to find, let's call it, a kind of solace in what Schmitt sees as the almost miraculous persistence of a real political entity in the world, despite a century's worth of bourgeois liberal efforts to crush or otherwise eradicate the truly political. And that entity is nothing less than the Roman Catholic Church.
And Schmitt is going to, in his life, have a somewhat complicated relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, isn't he?
He is, yes. So amazingly, for someone who was deeply, deeply Catholic, he was actually excommunicated from the church a few years after writing this text. I think he was excommunicated in 1926.
And did that make him less Catholic?
I think it probably made him even more Catholic.
Oh.
His response to his excommunication was, it simply showed that even the Roman Catholic Church had become sort of debased and degraded by these forces of modernity, and made it all the more important then to go and reclaim the true form of what Roman Catholicism was and represented for people.
Right, and so that the true form of the Catholic Church, I think it's fair to say for Schmitt, is its medieval form. literally and figuratively. Temporally, like actually.
The Church of the Inquisition was a church that Schmitt could probably get behind.
Right, the church that was utterly intolerant, knew nothing
Crusading.
Right, personal conscience, was kind of fine with going after the Saracens, but also medieval in the figurative sense as well, because when I think of that term, I think about an absolute authority sort of lording over the world around it. And that's definitely something that Schmitt sees in the church, not just as a good thing, but as like its primary function in the world as a political entity.
Yeah, he actually, at the very beginning of the text, he says that Roman Catholicism is, and he says, and everybody agrees with me.
Yeah. So true.
But he says that Roman Catholicism is the form of a Roman imperial power, so the Roman Empire, and the universalism that Roman imperial power represented, continuing then after the fall of the Roman Empire. So the church, as it were, is the continuator of that Roman imperial tradition of power. The problem is, as Schmitt sees it, is that the political form of the church has not been adequately defined. So that's what he's really setting out to do in this particular text, hence the title, Roman Catholicism in its political form. What is the political form of the church?
Well, I think the word representation is an important place to start to understand that political form. And it's probably worth pausing here to note that the way Schmitt is using the word representation is very different from our colloquial understanding of the term. When I say, this symbol represents something, we're assuming a degree of separation between the thing. For example, if I have two fingers held up, that represents peace. But Schmitt is using the word representation almost like dictation or like command. So there is the church through, the literal person of Christ, whom, as a Catholic, Schmitt sees as being like literally God, the font of power, the king, etc., etc., etc. The church isn't just the representation of Christ on earth, as in, a symbol of Jesus's power. The church is literally the entity that manifests that power in the world. So when the church says, this is your role in society, it's not like that's a suggestion or some sort of degree of separation where you can put yourself in and outside of it. That is your role in society. It has already been decided. And that's what Schmitt sees as valuable and important about, and really like essential about the church as a political form.
Yeah, the church represents what we might call the truly political. In fact, in another text that we'll be looking at in political theology, he says all modern politics is fundamentally theological in origin. And so this text, I think, can be seen in conjunction with that. This is an exploration then, perhaps, of the theological dimensions of what true politics, true power actually is.
He also says later on in this text that the Catholic Church is eminently political, not imminently, oddly enough, but eminently political. And I read that to be like it literally emanates this sense of power.
It's power out there in the world.
Right. It's physically there. And of course, he thinks everybody always already agrees with him.
Well, and I think he acknowledges that people disagree with him, but they're wrong.
Yes, they're either atheists, which is what he describes Eastern Orthodox as, or, mechanistic bourgeois liberals, which are, of course, the Protestants.
Protestants, yeah. So the definition, right? So when he asks the question of, well, what is it that is the political form of the Catholic Church? He provides us with a definition towards the beginning of the text. He says, the Catholic Church is a complex of opposites. He gives us the Latin term complexio oppositorum. He then continues, there appears to be no antithesis it does not embrace. It has long and proudly claimed to have united within itself all forms of state and government, to be an autocratic monarchy whose head is elected by the aristocracy of cardinals, but in which there is nonetheless so much democracy that, as Dupont-Loup put it, even the least shepherd of Abruzzi, regardless of his birth and station, has the possibility to become this autocratic sovereign.
As long as he's a man.
Yes. Well, its history knows examples of astounding accommodation as well as stubborn intransigence, the manly ability to resist and womanly compliance, a curious mixture of arrogance and humility. So what I take away from that is that what gives the Catholic Church its political form is its capacity to, let's say, enfold within itself these things which we would see as antithetical. It is both father who disciplines and mother who nurtures. And yet it can accommodate those antitheses within its institutional form. And that is then the source of its political power, its political virtue even.
Now, I think that there's quite a few antitheses that Schmitt does not mention that the Catholic Church seems to have some difficulty embracing. You know, if we bring this into the present day and really try to tease out what complexity of opposites are not enfolded in the Catholic Church, sexuality comes to mind as one that, you know, other than perhaps the sort of celibate monk figure as a closeted homosexual.
Sex, no sex.
Right. It's definitely not enfolded into the church in a socially meaningful way. So I think this argument of his is certainly an ideal that he's projecting onto the Catholic Church, and it's an obviously gendered one as well. For example, it is the shepherd of Abruzzi who can become the Pope is a man and never will not be. The idea that the version of masculinity that's enfolded by the Catholic Church is an active resistance, while the version of femininity that's enfolded into it is described as compliance. And for Schmitt, that is a positive thing.
So the fundamental characteristic then of the church, as he sees it in its political form, is this idea of the complexio oppositorum, its capacity to bring together within it actual points of conflict, and then to allow those points of conflict to coexist within the church. So it's, I think, one point of contrast here at the level of what he's calling its political form is that in the modern liberal constitutionalism of the kind that, say, succeeds with a Weimar Republic, the idea, I guess, would be that if you have oppositions, see these antitheses, that they get worked out through some form of legislative or maybe even just through some kind of discursive process, right? People talking through their differences.
Yeah, arguing.
Yeah. So maybe, for example, person A thinks, abortion is murder, and person B thinks that abortion is a private matter as a function of a woman's reproductive health. And the notion would be that in that context, you can sort of resolve those completely opposite points of view through some form of legislative outcome, right? So that the state mediates those oppositions and comes up with some kind of a solution.
Right. Like it's a private matter until a certain trimester, at which point it becomes murder.
Yeah, some kind of accommodation and compromise that both sides can sort of live with. Now, Schmitt, I don't think, would accept my abortion example because abortion is always wrong, and so therefore the Catholic Church doesn't accept within it. That's not a good example of complexio oppositorum.
Or to be more precise, the Catholic Church doesn't accept it, therefore abortion is always wrong.
It's wrong, yeah, exactly. The Catholic Church can act in a politically decisive way because one of the things that it has is moral authority. So over questions like, say, those big social questions around, for instance, maybe sexual expression or sexual self-identity, female reproductive rights, the church actually has the capacity to judge, to decide, and thereby creates or exists as a normative force in the world. So you don't have to worry about whether it's right or wrong. The church is there to tell you whether it's right or wrong. What do you think might be the example of these opposites that he's seeing coming then inside the church that he would acknowledge are there?
One that comes to mind for me, the struggle that's contemporaneous with his time between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. From a Marxist point of view, one of those sides is going to win, and you have to choose which side. The Catholic perspective, as Schmitt is narrating it here, would be, I think, this complexio oppositorium, in which both have a sort of duty toward the other as brothers. And so this might check for some of the most egregious offenses of the owner against the worker, but ultimately, because they owe each other their fidelity, as well as not only to each other, but also to their positions, their representations as worker, owner, whatever, then it's, sort of, I don't want to say pacifying, but, I would say pacifying. Schmitt would say harmonizing, probably.
Yeah. First of all, that's a very good example, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I think the point about it is that it's important to note that this is not some sort of Hegelian process where you have the negation of opposites that leads to some kind of deeper truth, right? So this is not a dialectical process. That's not what Schmitt means at all. He means that these two antitheses can be confronted as antithetical inside of the church. And I think you're absolutely right. That's exactly, I'm sure, what he was thinking of. Because if you imagine in 1920s Germany, you have you have
communism.
You have a bourgeois liberal economic order on the one side, which might represent, say, a normative understanding of what the state is there to achieve. But on the other side, you have a very powerful communist party and a very powerful socialist party representing worker interests. And there are like literal street battles that are taking place. There's a lot of political violence that's going on between these sort of irreconcilable class differences. And I think from his perspective, the Weimar Republic is not up to the task of somehow dealing with that kind of conflict. Whereas, to your point, yes, the Catholic Church can in its true political form, because the Catholic Church confronts both the bourgeoisie, or let's say the representatives of a normative economic order, and the exploited worker, confronts both of them with a kind of truly political, which is found inside of the church as a form, as an institution.
Right. Pragmatically speaking, the church defends private property. Always has, always will.
Yeah.
Pragmatically speaking as well, the church has, a social doctrine at this time that's kind of getting formulated. It really gets calcified during the Cold War, but out of necessity, I might add. But at this time, it's kind of got an early sense of a social doctrine that emphasizes bare bones workers' rights, which is more than many of the capitalist states at this time have, to be fair.
Schmitt is no capitalist.
No.
In fact, I think we could safely say he's a pretty strong anti-capitalist. Capitalism is in fact, I've got a quote for you. He writes, economic rationalism. I mean, I don't know if that it's fair to equate capitalism with economic rationalism, but I think that's right. Economic rationalism.
He's certainly not a liberal capitalist.
Equals capitalism.
Yeah.
So he says economic rationalism is so far removed from Catholic rationalism that it can arouse a specific Catholic anxiety. Modern technology easily becomes the servant of this or that want and need. In modern economy, a completely irrational consumption conforms to a totally rationalized production. A marvelously rational mechanism serves one or another demand, always with the same earnestness and precision, be it for a silk blouse or poison gas or anything whatsoever. Economic rationalism has accustomed itself to deal only with certain needs and to acknowledge only those it can satisfy. A devout Catholic, precisely following his own rationality, might well be horrified by this system of irresistible materiality. Devout Catholic.
Like him, the excommunicated.
Like him, yeah. He hadn't been excommunicated yet, not when he wrote this text.
True.
But the point then is that Catholicism is not, let's say, a solution to the problem of a modern economy which pits a working class against, say, an industrial class. Instead, it obviates capitalism altogether because it provides a different form of rationality, a deeper form of rationality. And so part of the problem of modernity is that we've become confused in terms of our rational selves. We think of our rational self in economic terms, homo economicus, wants and needs and personal preferences and all that. And I think for Schmitt, the point about that is that's actually taking us away from who we are. And so in order for us to rediscover ourselves, we have to, like, the church represents an institution where that's possible.
I think that this is one of those arguments where the germ of it is eminently reasonable. That economic rationalism, the idea that, for example, his illustration of this, that we assign more or less an equivalent sense of value to a blouse as we do to poison gas, that's a reasonable argument. And from my point of view, this goes to show that economic rationalism, I would just call it capitalism, does fuel a sense of alienation that leads to these sort of spiritual solutions sounding like good palliatives for people.
Yeah, I mean, from Schmitt's perspective, the problem of economic rationalism is you get trapped within it.
Yeah.
So the only way to understand your life is essentially as a rational economic agent. Mm-hmm. But for him, and this I think is where he's kind of following a Weberian kind of way of thinking, does that mean that you're just reduced to a consumer model where your life is essentially a set of preferences and your job is to go around and express those preferences across a market interface? I think that this is what Schmitt sees as the kind of calamity of modernity, that people's, let's call it, individuality has collapsed into this hyper-material economic rational form. So a lot of the problems that he sees in the world around him can be linked to that development. And the Catholic Church then represents in its institutional form a way out. I have a quote for you. He says, economic thinking has its own reason and veracity in that it is absolutely material, concerned only with things. The political is considered immaterial because it must be concerned with other than economic values. In sharp contrast to this absolute economic materiality, Catholicism is eminently political, to your point.
So what's not political for him is the Catholic Church's ability, which it doesn't even have at this point in history, to decide, for example, how many imports or exports will there be.
What tariffs should be placed on goods coming in.
What are the jobs? Like, he does not, or even some of these, like, hot button social policies that we in the contemporary, today, 2025, that we see as being big triggers for entry into reactionary politics. For example, like who marries who, things like that.
Yeah.
He's utterly uninterested in
Well,
those.
the church can solve those problems because they can assert using their moral authority.
Right.
Those things are wrong, and if you believe that, you're wrong. And
Exactly. So what makes the church political is its ability to make that call. Something that we'll see developed, I think, in Schmitt's later thought. But
so that makes it political, but what makes it eminently political in that sense? Because you drew attention to that earlier.
right. I think what makes it eminently political from this point of view is it's the fact that its assertions about the state of the world, what ought to be and what is, are not contestable through its frame of reference. When it says it is, it literally emanates the world as it is from the Catholic point of view, or even from any point of view.
So part of it is the authority of, let's call it, the Catholic voice that it brings to bear in society.
That's what I think, yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
As opposed to economic rationalism, which from his point of view, although this is definitely something we ought to contest, from his point of view, economic rationalism kind of puts all of these things up for the market to decide.
Self-organizes through the anonymous market.
Right, like, should we make more poison gas? Well, is it more valuable?
That's right. What's the demand?
Right.
Exactly. Actually, and I wanted to come back to that because the church represents a kind of personal authority. And as you pointed out, it's not the personal authority of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
It's the personal authority of the institution that, in this, as we discussed already, in this question of representation, it's the institution that represents Jesus
Yes.
Christ. So in that personal representation, the church can speak to you, can tell you things, can explain the world. And there's an interesting discussion in this text actually about the function of rhetoric that I think redounds to that question of the voice that the church brings to bear over society.
Yeah, I've got it right here.
Yeah.
In this comparison of rationalism and something irrational, in scare quotes, the classical is allotted to the rational, the romantic to the irrational. Rhetoric comes under the heading of the classical and rational. More decisive, however, is rhetoric in the sense of one might call representative discourse, rather than discussion and debate. It moves in antitheses, but these are not contradictions. They are the various and sundry elements molded into a complexio and thus give life to discourse. All of this presupposes a hierarchy, because the spiritual resonance of great rhetoric derives from the belief in the representation claimed by the orator. He's witness to the fact that the priest has his place in world history besides the soldier and the statesman. Like them, he is a representative figure. His place is not beside the merchant and the technician, who gives him only alms and confuse his representation with a decoration.
Lots to unpack in that dense paragraph.
No kidding, and I skipped some of it too.
I'm not even sure how much I understand. So this is in your bailiwick.
Yes, I got my degree in rhetoric.
So first of all, how does this contrast with more typical classic understanding of what we mean when we talk about rhetoric?
Right, so classical Western rhetoric is, we would call it a logic of influence. That is to say, the primary goal of any, like a discourse we would call rhetorical, is convincing,
Is this like
persuading.
Aristotelian rhetoric?
Yeah,
essentially?
exactly.
So the ethos, pathos.
Ethos, pathos, logos, things that we associate with the functioning of a democracy.
The power to persuade.
Or even a dictatorship that needs to keep people afraid in order to stay around, like a Machiavellian dictatorship, is still engaging in the logic of influence. Like, don't revolt, don't be annoying to me, because I'm going to use fear as a tactic of influence. So in other words, there's somebody out there that I need to persuade. So I'm indebted to that person in some way. They have some power over me. So under Schmitt's idea of the Catholic Church, well, that's not going to work, because the Catholic Church needs to have all the power. So instead of convincing or debating with the outside world, he works with what they call a representative discourse. That is to say, a form of speech or an architecture of speech, to use his own frame of reference, that manifests this power that it already has. For example, the ability to say to the priest, "You are a priest." That's not convincing the priest that he's a priest. It's drawing upon a preconceived frame of reference about what priestliness is and where it comes from in order to endow this person with power that the Catholics would say that person, already had or was destined to have.
So rhetoric in this context no longer is about, or is not seen as a mechanism for persuading. It's just straight, it's a kind of a communication, like a unidirectional communication.
Yeah, it's a dictation of an identity that by virtue of being is inscribed by the Catholic Church was already there, but sort of bears repeating, I suppose. And I think the important point that Schmitt makes here, that again, I think is important for his overall train of thought as a lifetime, writer, is the idea that the former idea, the influential concept of rhetoric, I debate you, is dependent upon this authority having existed. For example, think about the Aristotelian concept of ethos, that is my credibility.
Yeah.
You kind of have to believe that I have some authority. Perhaps I'm a doctor, so that means I'm smart and I know things.
Yeah.
You have to have accepted that I got authority to speak to you from somewhere. So Schmitt is taking that sort of intuitive argument and pushing it to an extreme by saying that this authoritarian discourse, I think that word is appropriately being used here, not as a description, rather than a derivative.
Meaning the authority of the
yes.
of the discourse, yeah.
Has to exist prior to the rational sense of speech having any purchase whatsoever.
I mean, it's true, in a way, it's all ethos, no pathos or logos, because they're not necessary.
Well,
they're nice to have, but
the
they're not
logos is Jesus Christ.
Yes, exactly. The logos is the ultimate logos, the word.
That's it.
And pathos, optional.
Yeah.
That's a good point. The way he's reading rhetoric in this context emphasizes then this notion of the church as having a power of command. And I think somewhere here, let me see if I can find it. He talks about that. He writes, "In the proud history of the Roman Church, the ethos of its own power stands side by side with the ethos of justice. It is even enhanced by the church's prestige, glory, and honor. The church commands recognition as the bride of Christ. It represents Christ reigning, ruling, and conquering. Its claim to prestige and honor rests on the eminent idea of representation. It engenders the eternal opposition of justice and beauty." I didn't know that justice and beauty were in eternal opposition. Good to know. "The antagonism is inherent in the general condition of human nature, though pious Christians view it as a peculiar form of an even peculiar malice. The great betrayal laid to the Catholic Church is that it does not conceive Christ as a private person, does not conceive Christianity as a private matter, something holy and inwardly spiritual, but rather has given it form as a visible institution." So the church represents the power, the authority, the ethos of Christ in its public form. And that's the only form that matters. And that's one of his complaints about Protestantism, is it takes the public element and makes it private, and then wraps itself up in virtue for doing this, for taking the thing that actually makes the church powerful and kind of stripping it away.
Yeah, this is actually a really good bridge from the rhetoric component here, because when we talk about influential rhetoric in the context of a liberal democracy, we're talking about public discourse. We're talking about, deliberation over matters of the common good. Under his point of view, what we know as the common good from a Habermasian idea of the public, which is definitely starting to grow, is essentially a separation from religious discourse, from those that are deemed private, which starts off as freedom of religious expression, at least according to Schmitt, and then branches off into these other things that we call private, like gender dynamics, for example.
Yeah.
In any case, what's rhetoric is not those things, is not convincing people to change their religion or anything else that they deem private, and is the public. They're conceptually separate. And Schmitt does not like that. He wants the Catholic Church to be the author of publicity, not just in it, and certainly not outside of it as a private matter.
It's almost like the public use of reason that we find inside Kant, which is about the marketplace of ideas and a public discourse, the purpose of which is to kind of bandy around different things to arrive at some kind of better outcome. This is more like the public use of rhetoric in that sense, right? And that rhetoric replaces reason. So it's not a question of rhetoric as a handmaiden to rational debate. Rhetoric is the handmaiden of authority in this regard. So I'm speaking to you to tell you what to do.
Oh, that doesn't remind me of our present conditions at all. Nobody does that.
But that is what gives the church its political form, is this particular rhetorical value that it has. I wanted to look at this question of representation again in terms of why he sees this as so important. Because when he talks about the representation of the church, as I understand it, he's referring to the fact that the church, which exists as an institution, but that institution exists like in your life as a Catholic, as like real people doing real things that represent that authority, that represent that sort of what he calls the ethos of justice, right? You go to the church, there's a priest, he says mass. It's an embodiment of power. So if you are imagining as a Catholic, you can confront the power that the church represents just through the practice of your worship, right? Just through the practice of being a Catholic, going to confession, taking the Eucharist and all that. And that contrasts then with power, let's say, that's exercised over you in the modern liberal constitutional state. Where is it? It doesn't exist in any kind of meaningful form. It exists as a set of abstract laws or some abstract court system or some abstract process by which a sort of a juridical order is created. But it's not a person. It's not a person who's plucking out the wafer and pulling out the wine and summoning God into existence in that moment.
Mm-hmm. This sort of, personal notion of the eminence of power that Schmitt is obsessed with, I think prefigures his investment in a Führer-based idea of sovereignty. The dictator is literally the personal embodiment, not only, primarily, of course, of the power of the state, of politics, more precisely, but also later on, it's the physical embodiment of a people, of a Volk, that has specific characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions maybe that this text raises for us is this a call for us to all become Catholic and return into the institutional fold that it represents?
I don't think so at all. No.
Or is it saying if we study the Catholic Church, we can then confront and understand what is true political form, and then use that as a way to move beyond the mess that a liberal neo-Kantian constitutional order has created. So to, as it were, educe a new kind of sovereignty that leans into, call it, lessons that we can learn from studying Roman Catholicism.
I think that's more right. The second one. I think the first one, Schmitt is really not buying this liberal notion. Well, I don't think it's a liberal notion, but he does. The liberal notion that human beings have the ability to reflect independently upon their circumstances and change. I think he would be very skeptical towards conversion stories, for example. So no, I don't think he would want the mullahs of Iran to find the light of Jesus Christ and convert to Catholicism. I think he would be fine with them being Saracens, that he can give their flowers for having a good authoritarian point of view like his own.
Yeah. I wanted to bring something up that he writes in this text, which I think is kind of interesting, around the differences that he sees between Protestants and Catholics. He writes, "It appears that Catholics have a different relation to the soil than Protestants.
Uh-oh.
Perhaps
blood and soil?
No, just soil.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps because in contrast to Protestants, they are mostly agricultural peoples who know no large industry." Now that's Weber right there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Weber's so.
It's also not correct.
No,
but,
it's wrong, but
it's
I mean, it's not completely incorrect. I mean, Weber was right that capitalism emerges more in Protestant countries, but nonetheless, anyway, that he says, and actually he acknowledges that that's a gross generalization because he says, in any case, this is generally true.
Yeah.
Why have there been no Catholic migrations, or at least none on the grand scale of the Huguenot or the Puritan? Which makes me think, but haven't there been large Catholic migrations?
I mean, present day,
Irish,
we think
anyway.
about the Irish.
Then he notes there have been any number of Catholic immigrants. Okay, so there have been Catholic
I love an
migrations.
argument that's so good you have to immediately hedge.
Qualify it, yeah. Irish, Poles, Italians, Croats.
It seems like a lot of...
It's nice to see the Croats getting a mention there. People don't often talk about the Croats. Probably most immigrants have been Catholic. So he says, so I just note.
So actually, I'm wrong.
This sounds like the way I write, right? He starts off by saying, there have been no Catholic migrations, then most immigrants have been Catholic. Okay. Because most simple Catholics were by and large poorer than Protestants. Poverty, peril, and persecution have impelled them. But this is why he argues that these are not real migrations, because he says they never lose the longing for their homeland. Compared with these indigent, dispossessed peoples, the Huguenot or the Puritan, meaning Protestants, has a strength and pride that is often inhuman, capable of living on any soil.
but would be wrong to say he find roots on every soil. He can build his industry far and wide, make all soil the servant of his skilled labor and, quote, inner worldly asceticism, and in the end have a comfortable home. All this because he makes himself master of nature and harnesses it to his will. His type of domination remains inaccessible to the Roman Catholic concept of nature. What do you make of that passage?
I think the first big point to make that's screaming out to me is that it doesn't seem like for him that it's just Protestants disrespect nature and Catholics respect it. No, it's a Volky appreciation.
There's a Volkish element, yeah,
that he really likes, that he attributes to Catholicism. What I'm seeing here is obviously with a little bit of historical hindsight, this is obviously a racializing argument that he's packaging in quasi-theological terms. He's attributing the Protestant mastery of nature to this idea that grace is an inward expression of mercy from God. Like, if you profess inward faith in Christ, then as opposed to doing the sacraments and things like that, then you are sort of forgiven. And so the kind of implication of that is that grace is something that you really primarily experience internally. It's not something that we find outside. So what he's extrapolating from this is that there's something about this character of soul of Catholics that draws them to a reverence of the specific soil that they are from. Not just any soil, not just Mother Earth, right? But the German soil.
Are you saying the external, internal, so grace as an internal concept in the Protestant concept?
Yeah.
It can be contrasted with grace as an external concept in the Catholic, and it's not just finding grace in the church, but then finding grace in
the world. And specifically, the idea, for example, that the Croat was born in Croatia is a grace to that person, and so they revere it, as opposed to the Protestant
and
born
they remain Croat,
right? As opposed to the Puritan who's born in England, and because their grace is only expressed internally, that means that they are sort of detached radically from the world around them, and they can, in their mind, they can set roots in America and be the exact same person as they were in the UK.
Yeah, see, that's the other thing I think that's interesting here, which is this notion that when the Protestant migrates, their migration is fundamentally a capitalist one, meaning that they can move into another place, and what they do is they create economy. They create rational economic logic in the world that they're sort of building up for themselves. And
famously, in the Third Reich, they accuse another group of people
of being rootless.
Being rootless cosmopolitans.
Yeah, so I mean, there is an interesting confluence of language, that I see. And so the Catholic, on the other hand, doesn't have that kind of ruinizing tendency, right? So the Catholic doesn't sort of export themselves, and along with it, a kind of depersonalizing capitalism. I mean, it's interesting to think between a kind of, let's call it, fervent form of modern day American evangelical Protestantism, which we associate with things like prosperity doctrines, right? Mm-hmm. So make as much money as you can, embrace the markets, right? Essentially capitalism as an adjunct to your Protestant faith. Versus a traditional Catholic in the U.S., which
they tend to be very third position,
which
we would use to describe fascism, that takes at the very least rhetorical issue with capitalist economics, if not actual problem, i.e. trying to nationalize industries, things like that. But you're right. Whereas we might look at for instance the Seven Mountain Mandate, that's an apostolic tendency, very, very Protestant, or a Donald Trump, a Southern Baptist style thing.
Yeah.
They are
gold-plated toilets,
right.
Proof of your love of Jesus.
Capitalism is very much an expression of their religious faith. Whereas when I think about them, the average traditionalist Catholic, if such a thing really exists, they all universally cite things like this feeling of alienation from economic rationalism, the idea that there's nowhere for them to express community outside of commoditization. These are big points of radicalization for them. And I think, it sometimes manifests as economic policy, but most of the time it manifests as a really, really strongly felt affective warrant for polarization.
Yeah.
There's no escape from economic rationalism outside of, my traditionalist interpretation of this faith, which, seems pretty Schmitty.
Another point I'll make in this text is it seems like Schmitt views Catholicism as a form of self-defense against a modern capitalist, liberal, bourgeois, neo-Kantian constitutional order. It's a way of
Reclamation.
alternative.
For instance, he goes after, in his words, humanitarian pacifism, which he describes as basically the biggest enemy of the Catholic Church in the spirit of the 18th century. And his issue with humanitarian pacifism is that it loses the capacity for enmity that a good Catholic needs to have towards the forces of evil.
And that anticipates something I think that Schmitt's going to be getting to in another one of his texts, that need to cast down your enemies, right?
Yes, you can't have them around. You cannot be tolerant towards them.
All right, no spoilers. No. That's going to happen in a later episode.
But we see this a lot in contemporary traditionalist Catholic and even modern Catholic discourse as well. There's a sort of enmity towards the idea that there is an essential human universal spirit that can be expressed outside of the Catholic Church, because there happens to be quite a few humans that are not Catholic, and therefore there's got to be something about humanity outside of that.
Yeah.
That's outside of the purview of the interpolation of the Catholic Church.
I mean, that's that complexio oppositorum, right? The church exists both to forgive, but also to condemn, right? It exists as a peacemaker, but it also exists as an agent of force, of destruction. So the crusading against your enemies is just as Catholic as, say,
Feeding the poor.
Yeah, the pastoralist vision of the church, and that's what gives it its power, because the human self is comprised of those kinds of antitheses. We are both capable of love, but also of hatred, of courage, but also of fear. And so I think what he sees, that the Catholic Church is a place where real sentiment, real emotion, real power, real let's just call it reality, actually takes place. And the problem is that in our modern, as he sees it, in our modern kind of economic form, we've been kind of numb to that reality of ourselves. We've bought off with material goods and so on.
So there's, I think, a good example of this. Actually, not a traditionalist Catholic, but certainly an ultra-conservative one. Matt Walsh, from, the Daily Wire fame.
Matt Walsh.
He's
Remind me.
Very, very popular among conservatives because he works for Ben Shapiro's news company.
Is he a former congressman or something?
No, he definitely
that's
is
Joe
not.
Walsh.
He's a right-wing political commentator.
Okay, a right-wing political commentator.
Known for the What is a Woman documentary, which predictably goes around and asks people, what is a woman?
Okay.
In any case, Matt Walsh wrote this book called Church of Cowards, a wake-up call for complacent Christians. He's a Catholic. The main point of his book is Christians have, taken love thy neighbor and love thy enemy to mean, never have enmity towards the evil. They've become too nice. They've become too soft. And we need to start bringing in the hard truths. Like, for example,
they're too motherly.
Right.
They're not fatherly disciplinary.
They don't have the father part. So we need to say that sin is sin and be really militant about things like being anti-abortion, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So this discourse, and I mentioned Matt Walsh because he's a relatively mainstream figure as far as really, really serious Catholic conservatism goes. This is all to say that this idea that the church has become, or Christians have become, too soft to effectuate the type of at times antagonism that the church needs in order to exercise its political form. This is a mainstream Catholic conservative argument.
And you see this as essentially a Schmittian argument.
Yes.
You know what? Perfect segue into something I also wanted to talk about and maybe conclude our first ever podcast episode. This Schmittian view of Catholicism and your point about it being a way of reclaiming something that's been lost. Your Supreme Court has quite a few Catholics on it, does it not?
Yeah, it sure does.
Do we know who they are?
So obviously we have Amy Coney Barrett, who we like to call
Justice Handmaiden.
Yeah. We have Clarence Thomas.
Yeah.
Who is?
Well, some people call him Justice Uncle Tom.
Many people have called we don't necessarily call him that.
I don't call him that.
Many people have called him that.
He is referred to sometimes by some people in that way.
We have, I don't even remember his real name, Justice Kegstand. Kavanaugh, that's right. Were there others?
Sam Alito. Very Catholic.
Is Sotomayor Catholic?
Yes, and Roberts is Catholic.
So there's a lot of Catholics on the Supreme Court.
And Gorsuch is High Church Episcopalian.
Which is essentially Catholic.
So so Gorsuch, if we can make him an honorary Catholic just for the purposes.
As a high church Episcopalian myself, I think they count.
Yeah. American jurisprudence, as represented by the Supreme Court, seems to incline to a kind of political Catholicism. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
I think so. And part of this is, Schmitt aside, is a matter of like discrete political strategy dealing with specific issue areas that isn't so much concerning, for example, the political form. For example, abortion. Like, since Roe versus Wade, which, of course, was a Supreme Court decision that, made abortion legal and protected under the right of individual privacy, and also kind of codified privacy as a right, worth noting, which is something that Schmitt doesn't like, not a fan of privacy. There has been, since that decision, and now up to the Dobbs decision, which reversed it, a very explicit strategy by Catholic political think tanks in order to train Catholic conservatives to go into the legal profession with more or less the singular purpose of overturning this law, because they viewed, Roe versus Wade, because they viewed it as being like a genocide level moral concern. However, I think it's also worth noting that that as a political strategy is kind of indebted to this executive notion of authority that Schmitt is locating within the Catholic Church and is seeing as kind of the moral duty of Catholics, or of people, maybe,
people as represented by the Catholic
specific
Church.
People, yes, representative people to exercise. When I think of somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, for example, probably the most theologically coherent Catholic who's conservative on the bench, she's somebody who very explicitly states in her private life, at least, she doesn't so much state this on the bench. That's important for reasons I think we'll get to. But in her descriptions of why she's gone into the legal system, her values come up consistently as a private justification.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that Schmitt idea of the church as the ethos of the church and the ethos of justice linked together inside the institution seem consistent then with, say, a Catholic jurisprudence that makes itself, I think the word might be eminent, via its decision-making. And I agree with you about the point of it that, one way to read it would be simply Catholic moral outrage over the persistence of abortion and therefore the need to overturn this one particularly offensive law.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be what's going on.
Well, because they're still there and they're doing worse things now.
Well, I mean, for example, the decision that they made to grant the president essentially immunity from law seems to me a very Schmitty way of looking at the world, right? That's a way of, as it were, expressing a form of Schmittian sovereignty. So I'm wondering, when we're looking at the actions of the U.S. Supreme Court, and this, let's say, I mean specifically these conservative decisions that are coming out of the Supreme Court, I'm tempted to see that as a kind of Schmittian jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you'd agree, but that is to say, people who are sitting there in these positions of authority, they are the kind of representational power that Schmitt likes, right? There is a person writing a judgment that affects your life. So, women in the United States now have harder time obtaining abortion, not because of some abstract thing, but because these are the names, these are the people who have made that the case, right? And that's the kind of personal embodiment of power that I think Schmitt sees as being the truly political. Mm-hmm. And this notion then that they have a position and they have a mandate together. And so the sort of jurisprudence that they're bringing out is consistent with, or at least resonant with, the kind of political Catholicism that Schmitt's talking about in this 1923-24 text.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the ways we can see this in terms of the form is the ways that the Supreme Court, honestly, since the first Trump administration, but arguably even since the Bush administration, has dramatically expanded its ability to litigate, essentially, to nullify even the movings of the executive, the movings of the legislative, but they do so quite conditionally. For example.
In what sense, yeah?
While we're in this current Trump administration, we're seeing Trump, going on television saying that the Constitution doesn't matter when he's deciding, for example, whether somebody who has a legal right to stay in the country should have a legal right to stay in the country. And the Supreme Court is like,
yeah,
okay. Because they agree with the form of power that it represents, the executive authoritarian form.
Yeah. Another example might be that this court seems very happy to have the death penalty on the books, right? Which again is part of that complexio oppositorum, right? On the one hand, the church is about forgiveness and life affirming,
Right.
but it's also about disciplining and punishing and executing the enemy. And that sense of the mandate of the court to sort of impose its own view of a moral order is, I don't know if I would call it, I mean, maybe the word Catholic jurisprudence is not...
Tradcath jurisprudence.
Tradcath. So this tradcath, this is the cool term. Yeah, a kind of traditional Catholic jurisprudence, which is to say that that there is the need for establishing a kind of eminent moral order that has transcendental claims that in some ways are outside of the Constitution.
Well,
right?
take, for example, Trump versus the United States, which was, I believe, decided last year, essentially giving the president immunity from, the rule of law when he's in office.
Yeah.
So this prevents Trump, for example, from getting prosecuted with respect to January 6th, which was a coup attempt.
And it's, to be clear, it wasn't just Trump. It was like the
president of the United
So
States.
it's actually a
yes.
decision that's built around sovereignty.
Exactly. The conservative Catholics cited, contra the rule of law, which is probably the single most elemental assumption of democratic jurisprudence, that the president should have legal immunity on all official acts. And of course, who gets to decide what acts are official? The president.
Yeah.
So he can say that anything that he's doing, of course I'm using he deliberately here, is completely outside of the ability to be prosecuted, convicted, held to account for the people. So this is, as sort of a meta-level decision, but also in the context of what it's responding to, which was a coup attempt by the former president and now current president, we see a consolidation of executive power and really a consolidation of sovereignty that goes above the law.
Schmitt would be very happy with that decision.
Oh, he'd be thrilled.
I mean, that is a very Schmittian decision, as we're going to see, because we're going to look at political theology and we're going to look at the concept of the political going forward, and we're going to see a sort of a vision of sovereignty that is completely in agreement with that particular decision, because it's essentially saying that the Constitution, as the ultimate arbiter of, call it legal power in the state, that's a fiction, that ultimately you need to have real sovereignty emerge, and the sort of the ability to, let's say, be immune from prosecution as sovereign. That's something that Schmitt would be entirely behind, right? That's real sovereignty emerging.
Kind of like the Pope, embodying the power in a singular person who in and of themselves is, because they have the ability to interpret and execute the law, is necessarily above those definitions.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it seems, if we're looking at the workings of the U.S. Supreme Court, I see a lot of Schmitt in what they're doing, right? They're creating a lot of Schmitt in the world around them, right? In the U.S. juridical landscape, they're overturning precedent. They're hiding behind concepts of originalism. On the other hand, if Catholicism is the ultimate originalism, then they're very originalist in that sense. So I don't know. It's a good example, I think, though, of the kind of Catholicism as political form that we can see today, because I think that's the kind of thing that Schmitt would see and would agree with, and would be approving of. That's how courts should act. That's them taking on their rightful role as moral arbiters in an iniquitous society to make sure that people sort of are confronted by real power outside of the sort of fiction of a neo-Kantian liberal constitutional order. No, let's get sort of 5 people or 6 people, whatever it is, who have the power to decide this is the way the law is going to be. And to your earlier point, would it surprise you, for instance, that the court may decide that things like gay marriage should now be made illegal? It's essentially contra that moral vision. Again, that would be a very Schmittian kind of decision, Schmittian way of thinking.
What I find frustrating about reading Schmitt is the constant avoidance of the fact that there is a body involved, a specific body involved in the enforcement of this moral order. He opines so much about how the Catholic Church carries the essence of masculinity and the essence of femininity. Okay, but what about women? You know what I mean? Like, what about actual human beings? He's, for all of the
They're busy in the kitchen making you dinner.
That's right. You know, they're busy making the communion wafers
Yeah.
in the yeah.
They know their place.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
And that's exactly
And
it.
if they don't, the Catholic Church is happily around to remind them of their place.
It's such an abstract argument that's premised upon a critique of abstraction, and I cannot help but read that as a cynical rhetorician that I am, as avoiding what he really wants to say.
Do I agree with that? I mean, I think he's quite. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yes, that's true. He doesn't want to come out and sort of engage with those, let's call it, infelicitous realities of. On the other hand, I think he's pretty clear. This is a sort of atavistic yearning for a mode of power. I mean, he's explicit that he says it's a medieval mode of power. He yearns for the days when there were knights and priests and merchants actually doing things and actually selling things, as opposed to anonymous market forces and anonymous armies and anonymous legislatures and so on. So the idea of real power manifesting in real terms in real people's lives in a real way, clearly something that he's yearning for, something that he sees as having been lost as a result of the rise of bourgeois industrial society, etc. So I think in that regard, I think he's pretty clear.
Yeah.
And as we'll see actually in his later text, that he builds on some of the ideas that we see here to articulate and formalize a model of power that, instead of, let's say, being retrofitted back onto a Catholic Church that, let's be honest, by the time he's writing doesn't really exist, can actually be fit looking forward onto the liberal constitutional order that he dislikes so much, meaning, okay, we're stuck with these shitty constitutional democracies. How can we make them more Schmitty?
They may, if we have to have a constitution, it may as well be based.
Exactly. So this text on the Roman Catholicism actually is a very good primer for a subsequent kind of Schmittian understanding of how to recuperate, or let's use your word, reclaim a sovereignty that has been somehow conveniently made to disappear under a neo-Kantian liberal constitutional fiction. And it's actually going to be that vision of politics that ultimately leads him to be so enthusiastic about a Führer-led German state in the 1930s. So I don't know, Reed, should we call it? We've been going on for quite a long time, so should we call it there and come back next time and maybe talk a little political theology?
That sounds like a plan.
Sound like a good thing. Get into some of the Schmitty things that we see inside of that text.
More Schmitt, more fans.
So we'll stop. So yeah, the Schmitt show will continue then, I think, with that text. That sound good?
Yep. See you then.
We're gonna stop all the Schmitty punning.
No, we won't.
But we'll try. Hey, Reed.
Yeah?
Our students are waking up.
Oh.
Okay, you do the credits.
You've been listening to While Our Students Are Sleeping, a podcast of theory and politics. If you like what we've done here, leave us a like or drop us a comment, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For updates, follow us on Rolf's Substack, rolfstromolsen.substack.com, or Reed's Blue Sky, reedvanskank.bsky.social. Finally, if you want us to talk about your favorite dead white guy, email us at rolfandreed@proton.me. This has been While Our Students Are Sleeping. See you next time for more political theory.